So quickly we'll recap where we were. We left off yesterday in Esther 5. Esther 5 is the point at which the decree has been signed for the destruction of the Jews on the 13th day of the 12th month. Mordecai puts on sackcloth and ashes. He repents. Esther calls to him. She learns that this has been decreed. She then goes into the king and makes a request of him, and that request was that she could throw a banquet for the king Ahasuerus as well as Haman. Chapter 5 ended with Haman leaves this first banquet that Esther has thrown. As he's leaving, he passes by Mordecai, who doesn't bow to him, and Haman gets all in a tizzy. And he goes home and he summons his wife and friends, and they say, hey, we've got the solution for you. What you do is you go and speak to the king, and you bring about Mordecai's death. Haman then says, that's a terrific idea. Men, go build a gallows. I'm going to need a gallows because I'm going to have Mordecai hanged thereon. That's how chapter 5 ends. We're going to start now in chapter 6. On that night could not the king sleep, and he commanded to bring the book of records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains, the keepers of the door, who sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. And the king said, what honor and dignity hath been done to Mordecai for this? Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, there is nothing done for him. Let me just pause here for a minute. Ahasuerus is the king of a vast empire. So it's a big deal. There probably were other plots against his life, I imagine. Maybe there were, maybe there weren't. Scripture doesn't say. But wouldn't you think you would remember them? And wouldn't you think that the person that foiled the plot, that gave the information that allowed the plot to be discovered, wouldn't you think, number one, you might remember their name? Wouldn't you think, number two, you might do something for them? Like at least, I don't know, send them a pizza or something? But what happens here is, and this is fascinating. If you recall what we said at the beginning, the word God, the word Lord, never appears in the book of Esther. For that reason, many people question whether Esther should be in the canon. Is it really something written by the Holy Spirit if it doesn't mention God or the Lord? As you read through Esther, one of the things that becomes clear is God's presence is unmistakable, even though the word is not written down. So what happens here is the king has insomnia. He can't sleep. He says, instead of, this tells you something else about Ahasuerus, by the way. Instead of getting an interesting book or something, he says, get the chronicles of my reign. Let's read something about me, because surely that would be the most interesting thing to do. So they pull the chronicles, and they read, and he realizes, oh yeah, there was this plot against my life, and the guy that foiled it I didn't do anything for. Verse 4. And the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman was come into the outward court of the king's house to speak unto the king to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. Now if you recall from chapter 5, what Haman was going to do, he was going to be at a feast the next day with the king and Esther. So the advice is, show up early. Get there beforehand. Plot, resolve the death of Mordecai, and then you can go into the feast. So he shows up early. Coincidentally, notice what happens. Verse 5, and the king's servant said unto him, behold, Haman standeth in the court. And the king said, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king said unto him, what shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, to whom would the king delight to do honor more than to myself? So a couple things here. So if you recall, for example, there's an incident with Nathan and David. David sins. And what Nathan does is Nathan goes to David and he tells him a parable, but he doesn't mention who the individuals are involved. And David has great outrage and anger at the person that had committed the acts described in Nathan's parable. And David pronounces judgment. If you will, he indicates that the person that does that should be punished. He then asks Nathan who it is, and what does Nathan say? Thou art the man. So this isn't, my point is Ahasuerus here is actually doing something intelligent, which is difficult for him. But what he's doing is he wants an honest answer. So he asks Haman, without indicating who he wants it to be done unto, what should be done for the man the king delighteth to honor. So it's actually a moment of lucidity for Ahasuerus. Notice what then happens. So what does Haman do? Well, who could the king possibly want to honor more than me? Right? So Haman's immediate thought is he's talking about me. But he didn't mention me by name, but he's talking about me. So Haman is excited about this. Verse 7, and Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delighteth to honor, let the royal apparel be brought which the king useth to wear, and the horse that the king rideth upon, and the crown royal which is set upon his head. And let this apparel and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man withal whom the king delighteth to honor, and bring him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor. So think about this. Is Haman incredibly wealthy? So we saw earlier that what he's done is he's offered a sum to Ahasuerus that is equivalent to the total tax revenues of the kingdom. It's close to it. It's just massive. Haman has massive wealth. So what Haman does in terms of being the reward he wants is he's the number 2 guy in the kingdom. He's incredibly wealthy. What he does is he picks here the reward that is the closest thing to being the king. Put on the king's clothes, put the crown on my head, I'll ride the king's horse, take one of your chief princes, and lead me about. It's as close as it can be to being the king. Right? So Haman's thought to himself is, this is great. The king asks me what I want, I'll tell him. Couldn't be better. Verse 10. And notice how quickly are the reversals in the book of Esther. Then the king said to Haman, make haste and take the apparel and the horse as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew that sitteth at the king's gate. Let nothing fail of all that thou hast spoken. So in other words, Haman has a little, create your own fantasy type thing. He creates his fantasy, and then Ahasuerus says, yes, do that for your enemy. Now someone said, God is not mentioned in the book of Esther. He's not mentioned by name. Is he there? Of course he's there. Now notice something in verse 10 that we shouldn't skip over. Do even so to Mordecai the Jew. Does Ahasuerus know that Mordecai is a Jew? He does, doesn't he? One of the things that's interesting here, so remember this, one of the possible meanings of Ahasuerus' name is I will be silent and poor. Now there's other meanings that are given. You can decide which one is right. But what we've seen so far with Ahasuerus is that he has this lackadaisical non-involvement in the reign of the kingdom. So much so that he takes his ring and gives it to Haman, and basically it'd be the equivalent of the president giving the pen to someone and saying, look, whatever laws you think make sense, just sign my name to them. In other words, he's abdicating the responsibility of exercising judgment. Well, with that in mind here, notice something. He knows that Mordecai is a Jew. That much he knows. But we're going to see here something that he doesn't know. And let me put it this way. He knows Mordecai is a Jew. He knows that there are a group of people in the kingdom that have been ordained to be destroyed. Right? Because he had a specific conversation about that. What that tells you is what he has not put together is the group of people that are to be destroyed are the Jews. Right? He hasn't connected those dots. Which, that in itself is sort of absurd. You ordain the destruction of a group of people that you haven't even bothered to figure out who it is. Verse 11. Then took Haman the apparel and the horse, and arrayed Mordecai, and brought him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaimed before him, thus shall it be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor. Now, by the way, if you read Haman's little fantasy there, what he says is have one of the chief princes lead him. Well, who's the chiefest prince in the kingdom? It's Haman. So Haman has to do this. And proclaim before him, thus shall it be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor. And Mordecai came again to the king's gate, but Haman hasted to his house mourning and having his head covered. So what happens in verse 11 is very interesting. They fulfill exactly what Ahasuerus said to do. They get to the end of it. Mordecai simply goes back to his job. He goes back to the king's gate. Haman goes home, and now he's really bent out of shape, right? So he was bent out of shape the previous day. When he's walking home, he passes Mordecai. Mordecai doesn't bow to him, and that just gets him in a tizzy. Well, if you imagine that gets him in a tizzy, what just happened here? He has to walk through the street holding the reins of the horse, right? It's the equivalent of Bill Gates, walking around, leading the horse's reins and proclaiming, "This shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor." So Haman's been out of shape. Verse 13, "And Haman told Zeresh his wife and all his friends everything that had befallen him." Notice this. "Then said his wise men and Zeresh his wife unto him, If Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews," which indeed he is, "before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but shalt surely fall before him." But just pause there for a moment. This is interesting. In some sense, legally at this point, everything is still against the Jews. The law of the Medes and Persians is unalterable, right? Their day of destruction is appointed, the 13th day of the 12th month. Haman hasn't lost any of his wealth. There's nothing here that changes what seems to be this ultimate outcome. But what happens here is this transformation, this change that has taken place is so dramatic that Zeresh and Haman's friends look at it and they say, okay, something's happening here. Something has happened, the tides have shifted, and this is not going to end up in your favor. It's so pronounced, it's so dramatic, they can see that. And again, it's as contemporary people would say, it's a God thing. And what's happening here is God's presence, His hand in this is so unmistakable that people can see it. Verse 14. "And while they were yet talking with him, came the king's chamberlains, and hasted to bring Haman unto the banquet that Esther had prepared." What I want you to notice how quick this is. So what happens is he goes to get counsel, and even while they're counseling, what happens? They come get him and say, "You see how quickly things are changing, and how quickly this is going to unfold? Hey, haste, we have to get you to the banquet." Chapter 7, verse 1. "So the king and Haman came to banquet with Esther the queen. And the king said again unto Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine, What is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? And it shall be performed, even to the half of the kingdom. Then Esther the queen answered and said, If I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage." So what Esther says is, here's what I need. Here's my problem, king, why I'm bothering you. The problem is we've been sold to be destroyed. If it were something as simple as us being sold into slavery, I wouldn't trouble you. You're a busy man. But the fact is, we're sold to be destroyed. Verse 5. Now we're going to see some passion from King Ahasuerus. "Then the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, Who is he, and where is he that durst presume in his heart to do so?" Who would have the audacity to do this in my realm? I'm the king of the realm. Who has the authority to destroy people without my permission? Right? And notice what it says. Who is he, and what? Where is he? Let me get my hands on him. Whoever's thinking to do this. And notice the language here, that durst presume in his heart to do so. Who has the presumption, the audacity to do this? Now notice something at this point. Haman has no idea that Esther is a Jew, does he? A couple things here. Is it significant to how this story plays out that Esther followed Mordecai's advice? It's awfully significant. Now think about this with me just for a moment. The law of the Medes and Persians is unalterable, so once it's written, it is going to be enforced. But take this for an example. If Haman had known that the queen was a Jew, can he craft the writing that goes out so this is not an issue? For example, if he says, all the Jews that are not in Shushan will be destroyed. See, part of what's going on here is what he has done is the law has been drafted in a way that would exterminate all Jews, including the queen, and Ahasuerus is not amused by that, right? If Haman had known Esther was a Jew, he could have handled this differently, is the point I want you to get. It's important to the way the story plays out that Esther followed Mordecai's instruction and did not reveal her kindred. Okay? Verse 6. And Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. Verse 6, notice Haman is described as an adversary. That very much makes him a type of Satan, because Satan is described as an adversary of the Jews. And what happens here is Haman is afraid. Verse 5, when Ahasuerus reacts, his anger is unmistakable. Haman now realizes that Ahasuerus' wrath is going to be directed towards him. Verse 7, and the king, arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went into the palace garden. Here's what I think's going on here. I believe it was Franklin that said, if you're angry, count to 10 before speaking. If you're very angry, count to 100. And that's good advice, right? There's a lot of things we say when we get angry or irritated and we just lash out, and it'd be better if we took a moment to ponder it. I think what Ahasuerus is doing here is something wise. So what happens is he's greatly angered, he's greatly irritated, and what he does is he says, I'm going to go take a walk, and I'm going to think about this. Now here's why this is sort of tricky. Ahasuerus realizes he has been duped, right? In other words, this guy I trusted, that I gave the ring, that he could sign anything he wanted, you know what he's done? He's went and signed something so stupid and evil that it's going to kill the queen. So Ahasuerus is, and the problem of this, of course, is number one, that's a problem. And you know the other problem? Haman did this with Ahasuerus' permission, right? So now Ahasuerus has the problem of, obviously, the guy that I put in charge of the kingdom is a scoundrel. And I got to get rid of him. I got to figure out how to deal with him. And I got to figure out how to deal with the fact that this idiot has signed something that would execute the queen and all the queen's people. So he takes a walk because he says, I got to clear my head and think through how I'm going to deal with this circumstance. This, again, is one of the... Ahasuerus has a few moments where he does things that seem to make sense, although he does a lot of things that didn't make sense. Verse 8. Let's read the rest of verse 7. And Haman stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. So the king has figured this out. He said, okay, look, I'm going to get rid of Haman, but I have to figure out how to do it. He's going out to conjecture, to ponder this subject. It's just then Esther and Haman says, well, at this point, the only hope I have is if Esther, who clearly has the king's ear, if she can prevail upon the king to spare my life, I could survive this. That's my only chance. So he's pleading with Esther. Notice verse 8. Then the king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bed whereon Esther was. What's happening there, I don't think that he's, trying to commit adultery sort of a thing, but what he's doing is he's, pleading sort of a thing is what he's doing. Well, does that remind you of anything at all? Is there an incident that's recorded somewhere else in the Scripture where a man and woman are alone and it's innocently misperceived? Genesis 39, right? That's what happens with Joseph, right? Joseph and Potiphar's wife. So notice what happens here. Then said the king, will he force the queen also before me in the house? Which I think that's probably not what was happening, but that's what Ahasuerus perceives to be happening. As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Get Job 40. It was an error in judgment by Haman to be alone with the queen and to allow this misunderstanding to occur. Notice Job 40, verse 12. Look on every one that is proud, and bring him low, and tread down the wicked in their place. Hide them in the dust together, and bind their faces in secret. What I want you just to notice is what Esther 7 verse 8 said, is it said, as the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. So they're covering his face, they're masking him in some way. What Job 40 tells you is binding their face. It's indicative of the proud being brought low, is what's happening there. He's being arrested and apprehended. Go back to Esther 7 verse 9. And Harbona, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, Behold also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, Hang him thereon. Verse 10. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. So Haman is hanged upon his own gallows, and notice how quickly things have changed. Chapter 8. On that day did the king Ahasuerus give the house of Haman the Jews' enemy unto Esther the queen. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was unto her. So this is finally the point in time Esther is going to reveal to Ahasuerus how she's related to Mordecai. Before she kept that secret. Verse 2, And the king took off his ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it unto Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. So a couple things here. The first is what's happened is the ring is taken back from Haman. He no longer has authority. It's now given to Mordecai. This is a return in some ways to how things were during Cyrus's reign. So if you recall, Cyrus is Ahasuerus' father. During Cyrus's reign, what he says is that the Lord hath commanded me to build a temple for him in Jerusalem. What he then does is he instructs the Israelites to go back to Jerusalem and build a temple there. Cyrus was a good king in that he was blessing Israel. What's happening here with Ahasuerus is he's finally making a good decision, and what he's saying is Mordecai is now going to be in charge, is going to exercise my authority. The next thing that's interesting there, Mordecai has replaced Haman in importance in the kingdom, but the other thing is Esther sets Mordecai over the house of Haman, so that he now has control over it. Verse 3, And Esther spake yet again before the king, and fell down at his feet, and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite, and his device that he had devised against the Jews. So notice what happens. Ahasuerus realizes he's been duped. He realizes the mischief that Haman had done. Haman's been killed. But what's happened with the law that he signed? It hasn't changed. The law is unalterable. The Jews at this moment are actually no different than they were before. And, well, they're a little different in the sense Mordecai is now in charge of he now has the ring and can execute laws. But that law that's on the books can't be changed under the laws of the Medes and the Persians. So that appointed date still exists. That threat is still out there. Verse 4. Then the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king and said, If it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seem right before the king, and I be pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews which are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that shall come unto my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? Then the king Ahasuerus said unto Esther the queen and to Mordecai the Jew, Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged upon the gallows, because he laid his hand upon the Jews. Write ye also for the Jews as it liketh you in the king's name, and seal it with the king's ring. Notice, for the writing which is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring may no man reverse. So here's what they do. The original law that was written, they can't reverse it. When it's written and sealed with the king's ring, it can't be undone. And what he says essentially is, the writing that was done before, I can't change that. But what I'll let you do is I'll give you the ring, and now write what you would like, and we'll send that out as well. What's beautiful about this verse, notice what it says here. Notice the end of verse 8. For the writing which is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring may no man reverse. And that's true. The beauty of the book of Esther is man can't reverse it, but who can? God can. So God isn't mentioned there, but the book of Esther is God reversing what man has decreed. Isn't that what's happening? It's exactly what's happening. Verse 9. Then were the king's scribes called at that time in the 3rd month. Now, if you recall, it's the 1st month when the first writing is written. We're now in the 3rd month. It's the 12th month when the day of execution is going to occur. Then were the king's scribes called at that time in the 3rd month, that is the month Sivan, on the 23rd day thereof. And it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded unto the Jews, and to the lieutenants and the deputies and rulers of the provinces which are from India unto Ethiopia, and 127 provinces, unto every province according to the writing thereof, and unto every people after their language, and to the Jews according to their writing and according to their language. Verse 10. And he wrote in Ahasuerus' name and sealed it with the king's ring, and sent letters by posts on horseback and riders on mules, camels, and young dromedaries, wherein the king granted the Jews which were in every city to gather themselves together and to stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, and to cause to perish all the power of the people and province that they would assault them, both little ones and women, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. Notice what that is saying. What did that law enable the Jews to do? All it really did is enable the right of self-defense. So think then for a moment what happened beforehand. The way the prior law was designed, anyone in the kingdom had the lawful authority to go up to a Jew on the 13th day of the 12th month and kill him, and the Jew had no right to resist. Isn't that what that's telling you? That writing can't be reversed. So what Mordecai does here is he simply sends these out and says, guys, you have the right to resist them, and you have the right to take the spoil of them for a prey. What's fascinating about this, think about what's going on here. Well, and let's go to the next verse. Verse 12. Upon one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, namely upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, the copy of the writing for a commandment to be given in every province was published unto all people, and that the Jews should be ready against that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. So now what's happening is the Jews are going to prepare for that day. Verse 14. So the posts that rode upon mules and camels went out, being hastened and pressed on by the king's commandment, and the decree was given at Shushan the palace. And Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, and with a great crown of gold, and with a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. If you recall in chapter 3, when the first decree was given, the city of Shushan was perplexed. So now they rejoice because they recognize that what is right is being done. Verse 16, the Jews have light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a good day. And many of the people of the land, notice, became Jews, for the fear of the Jews fell upon them. A couple things. Is it possible for a Gentile to become a Jew? That verse says yes, doesn't it? And the people of the land became Jews. What's happened here, what has gone on in Media Persia is so profound Everyone in Medo-Persia has seen this first decree. The Jews are going to be destroyed on that day. Haman, the magnificent, whose massive wealth, number 2 in the kingdom, what happens is he ends up having to lead Mordecai around on a horse. Mordecai is now the new second in command, and there's a new decree, and it's obvious to everyone. It's sort of like this. I can't remember who mentioned earlier this weekend, Lazarus. You know the problem with Lazarus for the Pharisees? When Lazarus dies, and they hold a funeral ceremony, he's dead. They put him in the tomb. And his loved ones cry, and the people that don't like him are there, but every single person involved knows he's dead. Right? So, let me put it this way. This will happen for some of us. Sometimes when you die, it'll be people that will show up just to confirm you really are. Right? And what happened with Lazarus was, as of 2 days, no one thought Lazarus is faking. No one thought it was a scam. Everyone knew and believed he was dead. But what happens is, when he's resurrected, the problem for the Pharisees is, how do you say this guy isn't the Son of God when he walks into town and very plainly resurrects someone who was dead as dead can be? Right? The proof is overwhelming. Well, you have something that's similar in magnitude going on here, in that it's absolutely clear that this destruction is going to happen, and there's this miraculous deliverance. The people of the land became Jews. Why? For the fear of the Jews fell upon them. Do they recognize this as God's people? They plainly do. And that's why people convert. Chapter 9. Now in the 12th month, that is the month Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's commandment and his decree drew near to be put in execution, in that day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, notice, though it was turned to the contrary. There's so many things in the book of Esther that are that way. They're turned to the contrary. That the Jews had rule over them that hated them. The Jews gathered themselves together in their cities throughout all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus to lay hand on such as sought their hurt, and no man could withstand them, for the fear of them fell upon all people. Verse 3, and all the rulers of the provinces, and the lieutenants, and the deputies, and officers of the king helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. What happens there is Mordecai, his power is clearly understood and respected by the local rulers. So what do? They help the Jews to resist what's about to happen. Verse 4, for Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went out throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai waxed greater and greater. He increased greater and greater. Verse 5, thus the Jews smote all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, and slaughter and destruction, and did what they would unto those that hated them. Think about this with me for a moment. When Haman's original writing is sent out, what it does is it gives all the people in Medo-Persia the right to go kill Jews on that day. And what it's doing is it gives them the right to do that, but every individual can make a choice as to whether or not to do that. You can just sit home and choose not to. Once Mordecai writes the new writing that gives the Jews the right to defend themselves, once the fear of the Jews falls upon the land, because all the local rulers of the provinces realize, wait a minute, the guy that's in charge now is Mordecai, and what I'm going to do is do everything I can to help the Jews. If you're one of those guys, let's say you're one of those folks in a province, and you were thinking beforehand, you know what I should do? I should go kill a bunch of Jews on the 13th day of the 12th month, and oh, by the way, I'm allowed to keep their stuff, so it's win-win-win, right? Well, when the tide shifts, and now it's clear that, hey, the guy that signed that before, he's been hanged on his own gallows, and there's a new guy in charge that's actually a Jew, and oh, by the way, all the local governmental people are helping the Jews because the clear policy of the kingdom now is to support the Jews, right? What you might do is you might say, yeah, I used to think it made sense to go kill the Jews, but I no longer think that's a good idea. Right? I mean, there's nothing to... What I want you to get, does anyone remember when we talked about the Amalekites, what did the Amalekites do to earn God's wrath? Does anyone remember? What the Amalekites do that causes God to swear that he will war with them from generation to generation and utterly blot them out is that Israel is leaving the promised land. And they leave, millions of people, right? They leave the promised land, and there's a caravan of them, and what happens is the ones that are feeble and weak are the stragglers. They're at the end of the caravan. And what the Amalekites do is they hide out, and they let Israel pass by, and the ones that are weak and feeble and struggle at the end, they come in and kill them. That's what they do. Now, my point is, what the Amalekites are doing at that point in time, you have to understand how willful that rebellion is. When Israel leaves Egypt, it has been proven beyond doubt to anyone that is not insane that the Jews are God's people. Right? Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go." Pharaoh says, "I'm not doing that." So the first plague happens. Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go." Pharaoh says, "Not doing that." The next plague happens. And these continue, and water turns to blood, and there's lice, and the cattle die. And then finally, God says, "Look, I'm going to kill all the firstborn." All the firstborn die. Pharaoh at that point, it's not that he wants to let Israel go, it's that he can't keep them anymore because his kingdom is being destroyed. So he lets them go, changes his mind, goes out and pursues them. They walk across the Red Sea on dry land. He says, "Oh, let's get them. Go fast because you got to catch them." And they all drowned. Now my point is, what happens at that moment in time? How dumb do you have to be on the earth and not realize God's doing something with Israel? Right? Everyone knows it. The act of the Amalekites in deliberately attacking the weak of God's people is the heart attitude of such contrariness, such resentment against God, such hatred of the truth, that they do it to their own destruction. You follow me? In other words, it is such a willful, evil, depraved act. It is an act of hatred against God, and God decides He's going to war with them. What I want you to get is that same heart attitude the original Amalekites had when they attack Israel leaving the Promised Land is the same attitude you're seeing here. Because anyone with half a brain would say, "Wait a minute, that's God's people. It is folly for me to lay a hand on them." You with me? We're in verse 6. "And in Shushan the palace the Jews slew and destroyed 500 men." These are folks in the palace, so these have to be the 500 dumbest guys there are, right? Because what happens is Mordecai's now in charge in the kingdom, and they have the idea, hey, let's mass ourselves together and identify ourselves as idiots so the Jews can kill us. Which is essentially what they're doing. They can't refrain. Their hatred of the Jews, and by proxy, their hatred of God is such that they can't pass up this opportunity to kill some of them. Verse 7. "And Parshandatha, and Dalphon, and Espatha, and Poratha, and Adelia, and Aridatha, and Parmashtha, and Arisai, and Aridai, and Vajathatha." And I don't think I pronounced any of those right. Verse 10, "the 10 sons of Haman." Now, I think I misspoke last night. I think what I said was that Haman had 7 sons. That's incorrect. Haman has 10 sons. Job had 7 sons and 3 daughters, but Haman has 10 sons. What's going on here is the 10 sons of Haman, are they Agagites, by the way? They have to be, right? Haman's an Agagite, so they have to be Agagites. They're Amalekites. What's going on here is perhaps 2 things. One, they see a great opportunity to kill the Jews, so they can't help themselves and they want to take it. And 2, they resent what's happened to Haman, so they're going to exact their vengeance. Well, what happens, of course, is they're all destroyed. Verse 10, "The 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, slew they, but on the spoil laid they not their hand." Notice something about this. When Haman signed the original decree, what it said was that anyone that wanted to kill the Jews could kill the Jews, and they could keep the spoil for a prey. In other words, it was creating a financial incentive for people to go kill the Jews. If you recall, what happened in 1 Samuel 15 when Saul was to destroy the Amalekites? What did God tell Saul about the Amalekites' stuff? Don't keep any of their stuff. Kill their livestock. Don't keep any of it for a possession. And what did Saul do? Well, he kept it. And he said, well, we're going to sacrifice unto the Lord. It'd be better if you just did what he said, right? When Mordecai authorizes the letter that goes out, he authorizes the Jews to take the spoil of the prey of those that they defeat. But what happens is they don't do that. So that's good. What they're doing then is they're mirroring exactly what Israel should have done in destroying the Amalekites. They shouldn't have taken any of their stuff. They should have just destroyed it all. Okay? So the response here is the response of faith. Verse 11. On that day the number of those that were slain in Shushan the palace was brought before the king. And the king said unto Esther the queen, the Jews have slain and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the palace, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is thy petition? It shall be granted thee, or what is thy request further? And it shall be done. Then said Esther, if it please the king, let it be granted to the Jews which are in Shushan to do tomorrow, also according unto this day's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged upon the gallows. So just as Haman wanted Mordecai to be hanged, demonstrating him to be accursed, what Esther wants here is those sons of Haman that they were massing to destroy the Jews. She wants it to be publicly demonstrated that they're accursed. And that's what's happening there. Verse 14. And the king commanded it so to be done. And the decree was given at Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. For the Jews that were in Shushan gathered themselves together on the 14th day also of the month Adar, and slew 300 men at Shushan, but on the prey they laid not their hand. But the other Jews that were in the king's provinces gathered themselves together, and stood for their lives, and had rest from their enemies, and slew of their foes 75,000. But they laid not their hands on the prey. Just to give you an idea of what's going on that day, there are approximately 66,000 people that died in the Hiroshima explosion. So what's happening here is, essentially the dropping of a nuclear bomb on the Amalekites. They lose more people than were lost in Hiroshima. Verse 17. On the 13th day of the month Adar, and on the 14th day of the same rested they, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews that were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day thereof, and on the 14th thereof. And on the 15th day of the same they rested, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. So what happened is the Jews that were in Shushan had an additional day of vengeance beyond the one that was had throughout the entire Media-Persia Empire. Verse 19. Therefore the Jews of the villages that dwelled in the unwalled towns made the 14th day of the month Adar a day of gladness and feasting, and a good day, and of sending portions one to another. Verse 20. And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters unto all the Jews that were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both nigh and far, to establish this among them, that they should keep the 14th day of the month Adar, and the 15th day of the same yearly, as the days wherein the Jews rested from their enemies, and the month which was turned unto them from sorrow to joy, and from mourning into a good day, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and of sending portions one to another, and gifts to the poor. And the Jews undertook to do as they had begun, and as Mordecai had written unto them. Verse 24. Because Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had devised against the Jews to destroy them. Notice this carefully. And had cast pur, that is the lot, to consume them and to destroy them. There's something very interesting going on here that I want to hopefully explain. What Haman does is he casts the lot to destroy the Jews. Now, if you recall, what Haman had done is he had set himself up where people would cast lots before him. And the idea there was they would cast the lots to determine what outcome or what specific details God wanted. What he does there is he casts the lot. So think about that with me. If you recall, it was in the first month, the 13th day, when the decree was signed. And it called for the execution of vengeance on when? The 12th month, the 13th day. So consider this. The lot belongs to the Lord, doesn't it? It does. And what happens is Haman casts the lot. What he does is he audaciously and presumptuously looks at the lives of the Jews that he's going to destroy and says, I'm just going to let chance determine the date of their destruction. And you know what happened? It had been better for him if he had chosen a date within a month before the events in Esther unfolded. But what happens is that lot is cast. God chose a date that would allow the events in Esther to unfold and the undoing of the law that would be written. Do you follow me what's going on there? So what happens is Haman has the audacity to think of how obnoxious it is. Number one, to seek the destruction of a people and say, I don't care what day they die on. I'll just cast it to chance and see what it turns out to be. Well, he does that, and God controls the timing of that because God wanted enough time in there to accomplish the events in the book of Esther that were going to reverse what Haman had intended. Verse 25. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letters that his wicked device, which he devised against the Jews, should return upon his own head, that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Wherefore they called these days Purim, after the name of Pur. So that Jewish feast is named after the casting of the lot. So Haman has the audacity to cast the lot for their destruction, and what it shows is that although he had lots cast before him because he set himself up as God, and the God that's not mentioned in the book of Esther was still in control. That's the point. Verse 26. Verse 27. The Jews ordained and took upon them and upon their seed, upon all such as joined themselves unto them, as it should not fail, that they would keep these 2 days according to their writing and according to their appointed time every year. And that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city. And that these days of Purim should not fail from among the Jews, nor the memorial of them perish from their seed. Then Esther the queen, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew wrote with all authority to confirm this second letter of Purim. And he sent the letters unto all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the king of Ahasuerus with words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim in their times appointed, according as Mordecai the Jew and Esther the queen had enjoined them, and as they had decreed for themselves and for their seed the matters of fastings in their cry. And the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. Chapter 10. And the king Ahasuerus laid a tribute upon the land and upon the isles of the sea, and all the acts of his power and of his might, and the declaration of the greatness of Mordecai, whereunto the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? In other words, there's extra biblical sources that testify as to these events happening. Verse 3. For Mordecai the Jew was next unto King Ahasuerus. An interesting study that you might want to do is take a look at Joseph and Daniel, and you'll see that Mordecai occupies a place in a Gentile kingdom just like they did. For Mordecai the Jew was next unto King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitude of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people, and speaking peace to all his seed. So we'll stop there. I'll just make one final remark, and we'll conclude. One of the things that's instructive about God's Word is everything about it is intentional. Every word is chosen. Everything is done for a reason. So what happens is some look at things and say, well, God's not mentioned. That's a mistake. It's a flaw. God shouldn't have done it that way. And what it's actually doing is it paints this beautiful, elegant story where you can read Esther on a really superficial level. You can view it as a love story. You can view it as God's deliverance. And all of that is true. But when you run the cross-references and see what's actually going on, you can see very clearly it's the next stage of this ongoing war that God has with the Amalekites as to how He's going to bring about their destruction. Amen? Amen. Lord, thank you for this time. We thank you for the truth of your word. We thank you that you've preserved it for us without error. It's in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ we pray. Amen.